This is DW News Africa. Coming up on the program, Africa has the power, so why aren't the lights on for millions of residents? Ethiopia is home to Africa's biggest hydroelectric dam and dreams of becoming an energy powerhouse. We look at the challenge of delivering that power, not just producing it. And Abiy Ahmed's Prosperity Party swept Ethiopia's elections. But with a vote marked by conflict, a weak opposition, and entire regions left out, what does this tell us about the state of the country? I'm Michael Okwu. Welcome. Ethiopia has built Africa's largest hydroelectric dam, doubling its power generation and fueling hopes of an economic transformation. So why are millions of Ethiopians still living in the dark? And what does that tell us about a challenge facing much of Africa, getting power from the source to the people who need it? We'll be speaking about what it will really take up to light up the continent. But first, this report from DW's Selo Oneko and Esheti Bekela.
This is Africa's and Ethiopia's biggest hydroelectric dam, and these are the people hoping to one day benefit from its power. Ethiopia's government promised the dam as a ticket to a modern future, yet almost half of all Ethiopians still live in the dark. In a small village in Ethiopia's southern Gedeo zone, this firewood is the only form of fuel Workinesh Negusie has. Her village is not yet connected to the national electricity grid.
We survive using firewood. We don't have anything else like charcoal. We used to have charcoal, but now it's become very expensive.
Workinesh is a mother of 4. Her children urgently need light in their home to study after school.
It's affecting their ability to study. How can a student study at night if there's no electricity?
And Workinesh's family isn't alone. Over 60 million Ethiopians live without access to power. That's almost half of the population. Yet Ethiopia's government has big plans to expand its grid. Launched with much pomp and to an audience of regional leaders, Ethiopia opened the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, in September 2025. Built as a symbol of national pride, this dam was mainly financed by Ethiopians, including many ordinary citizens. That was largely because potential international funders were pressured to stay out by Egypt, which feared it would get less of a share of the Nile water. Now that the dam was built, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed stressed that it would not only benefit Ethiopia, but the entire region.
For our brothers in the countries downstream, Ethiopia built the Grand Renaissance Dam to prosper, fill the region with light, and change black people's history.
With a capacity of 5,150 megawatts, the dam has doubled Ethiopia's energy generation. Now, the challenge is bringing power to remote areas like Workinesh's village.
Until about 7 years ago, it wasn't more than 44%. However, we've now reached approximately 54%. The ongoing grid-related work will enable us to increase this to around 78% in the coming years. We're also working on off-grid solutions.
While international backers like the World Bank have pledged to back this grid expansion, analysts believe that it's ultimately up to Ethiopia's government to connect its people to the grid. And as researcher Tom Lavers points out, while the dam might be the answer to generating more power, it certainly wasn't a direct ticket to a modern future.
The challenge of meeting universal access to electricity, which remains the government's goal today, is an extraordinarily difficult one. A country the size of Ethiopia, with a population that is as dispersed as Ethiopia's is, with generation concentrated in places where the majority of the population don't live.
While the dam may not yet be powering all of Ethiopia's households, its regional effect was more immediate. Ethiopia started exporting surplus power to Kenya and Djibouti, a welcome addition to the still emerging regional power pool. And for Ethiopia, a bit of income to maintain and finance all of its new infrastructure, including the expansion of the power grid. The power is transported via a 1,000-meter-long high-voltage line from Sodo in Ethiopia to a substation in Suswa in Kenya. Here in Suswa, about 100 kilometers away from Nairobi, is where the electricity from Ethiopia ends up and is fed into the Kenyan grid. The amount transmitted at the moment is still very low, but both countries are hoping to expand on regional connectivity. Similarly to Ethiopia, Kenya has big ambitions to grow and scale its economy. In Kenya, 75% of the population is already connected to the grid. The power is sometimes faulty and unreliable, but unlike Ethiopia, Kenya only has a few last connectivity miles to go. Currently, Kenya relies on a mix of geothermal, wind, solar and water. Over 90% of its energy comes from renewables, and yet when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, or when drought reduces water levels, the amount of power Kenya generates is barely enough to keep its economy going. So it needs a reliable backup source. And the power from Ethiopia is a big part of that. For Kenya's state power transmission company, that expansion can't come fast enough. While they're working on upgrading their power infrastructure, regional demand continues to grow.
As any country industrializes, power means the power demand of our customers moves from availability to reliability. Our customers now want very stable power, especially when we go to industries that manufacture sensitive equipment like microchips and all the others. They require stability of power. Data centers require very stable power and also reliable power.
And this is the point. Kenya has big dreams of becoming East Africa's tech hub and finding its place in the world of AI and big data. And here, reliable power is key. East Africa's biggest data center currently runs on 4.5 megawatts, a far cry from data centers in the US and China operating at hundreds of megawatts. But the first step is proving they can handle what's already there. Set in a prime location with good internet and between two electricity substations, this data center doesn't have to deal with the ups and downs of power outages.
We're getting fed directly from the substation, whereas if you're living up country or in a residential area, your power transmission has to go through various different layers. That's why you might be seeing power outages, which are because of say faults in the transmission as opposed to any big issues with the generation.
Those layers between the power and the people who need it are what the whole East African region is working to cut through. The electricity is being transmitted, but the question is how far it reaches and how fast.
To look into this further, I'm happy to welcome energy expert and economist Lungile Mishele, who's currently serving as an advisor to South Africa's Minister of Energy and Electricity. Dr. Mishele, Ethiopia has just doubled its generating capacity with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Yet more than 60 million Ethiopians still live without electricity. 60 million. We so often can produce power, but actually connecting it to households remains difficult. Why?
Thank you so much for having me. And therein lies the challenge, right? The generation aspects have been perfected over time and especially over the last 10 years or so, but the issue really lies in transmission and in distribution. So how does the electricity get from the major nodes to where it's actually required, and how does it get to the people? You are sitting with what we typically say 60% of sub-Saharan Africa, which is which do not have electricity. And the truth of the matter is that this generation that lies all over the continent or all over sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's in South Africa, it's in Botswana, Ethiopia, as you rightfully mentioned, with the Renaissance Dam, you've got Mozambique, numerous other countries. But in terms of scaling up on the transmission and the distribution, that is where things seem to be falling apart or seem to be lagging. And then, of course, there's the real issue of if we eventually get the transmission right, especially cross-border, the interconnectors right, then you also need to focus on the distribution and how does that work with local municipalities or provinces or local governments, and then eventually getting into the household. And then this, of course, then speaks to our households. Are they equipped and are they built, and is a typical house equipped to allow electricity to come in? And that becomes another challenge.
If you could pinpoint some facet of that distribution phase, what is it? What is it that seems to be the most problematic issue here?
So the distribution is in two parts. One is getting the grid where it's supposed to go. And that has a significant cost. And the truth of the matter is the other person on the other end, will they be able to afford it? So, you know, municipalities and utilities can focus on the distribution element and get electricity to where it must get to. However, the key thing is, are people going to be able to afford it? And, you know, if you look at places like Europe or America or, you know, even Asia, lots of distribution happening there across multiple states, multiple cities. And at the end of it, the consumer can pay and the utility can justify why that investment needs to be made. In sub-Saharan Africa, when you consider the amount of work that needs to go into it and the investment, but you also need to consider the fact that the region is amongst one of the poorest and also one of the most unequal. And the question then becomes, how do we really have these trade-offs of electrifying people, but people who, for the most part, economically speaking, you cannot justify that investment. And typically this is when governments then step in and governments then aid that investment to make it more affordable for their citizens.
Everybody ought to have the right to have their homes powered. There must be some baseline level. So keeping that in mind, and I think you're getting into the sort of the next phase of my questioning here, there must be a long list of actors here. At the end of the day, who's responsible for that last mile? We can't just put it necessarily on the consumers who want to not live in darkness. Is it national governments? Is it local authorities, utilities, international lenders, or international bodies like the UN? Who?
So everybody is responsible, but to be very frank, it's the national government that needs to issue an imperative that says that they want to electrify X amount of homes, 10 million homes over the next five years, or whatever their target is going to be. And thereafter, it needs to cascade down to the utilities that must provide the generation, the transmission, and the distribution. You then need to go into the municipalities. They also need to have their plans in terms of rolling out these electrification plans. You now need to look at regulation. How are you going to fund this? How is it going to be regulated? Who's going to pay for what and when? And then, of course, you now need to go into the funding aspect, because as we know, most governments and utilities and municipalities are cash slow. So ultimately, you now need to bring in lenders, and then it becomes a bit of a commercial structure. And of course, once you start adding in that financial aspect, then the real questions around who's going to pay, can they afford to pay, do we need to look at guarantees, what vehicle can we possibly use to invest in these projects to make sure, as you rightfully say, that people receive their constitutional right of being electrified.
Okay, so financing obviously a big piece of this. Some other issues. In cities, extending electricity often means connecting one more neighborhood and then another and so on. In rural Africa, it means reaching scattered communities, maybe hundreds of kilometers from existing infrastructure. Does universal access for everyone, require a different strategy for rural Africa than for urban Africa?
So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because ultimately, people often say, but why is electrification not at 100%? And I can tell you now, I mean, even in South Africa, it's above 90%. If I look at like your North Africa, it's above 95%. And it can never get to 100% for exactly that reason, that some of the areas are so remote that it does not make sense to send the grid to those particular areas. So to your point, you need a strategy devised specifically for remote rural areas, and also taking into account their lack of affordability. So you might look at cook stoves, for instance, where they are not necessarily connected to the grid, but they're able to have cook stoves where they can cook outside. You could look at solar panels, and then it comes with lights and battery, and they would still remain off grid, but they are able to be partially electrified, having lights in the home, having a little plug point where they can plug in a radio, maybe even a TV, and then so there are numerous things that one could devise. But one needs to think smart and think strategically. And of course, it's very important to consider that you don't want to disrupt the way people live. And I'm going to give the example of the Maasai in Kenya, where they are nomad by nature. So you can't tie them down to a fixed structure with a light and a switch. You have to allow them to move from one area to the next to be able to graze. And so as a result, your solution, even at that point, needs to be a mobile one as well, to allow them to continue with their way of life.
Interesting. We all know that off-grid solar energy is transforming lives across Africa, but critics argue it's also allowing governments to shift responsibility onto individual households rather than investing in public infrastructure. Is there a risk that solar becomes a substitute for building grids countries ultimately need? In fact, is that already happening?
We need to be very careful about the type of electricity we give to people. And I'm glad that you mentioned the grid-tied aspect, because often we speak about off-grid and we speak about solar. And I just mentioned like the 4 lights and a radio and like a battery in the home. But truth be told, that is not enough to industrialize. That's not enough to grow any sort of economy. So with those 4 little lights in the home and solar that's going to go off at 6 p.m., you can't certainly talk about, I am now going to be an industrialist. I'm going to grab a sewing machine and start sewing, or I'm going to start baking. You can't possibly do that. And the question then becomes, the electrification that we are allowing or we're giving to people, does it allow them to be economically active? And if it does not do that, then the question is that we're just trying to plaster over a bigger issue. And it will come back a couple of years later when people say, but I need more, I want more, what's the plan?
Lungile Mashele, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
In Ethiopia, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's party has won a landslide victory in this month's elections. Abiy's Prosperity Party gained a huge majority in parliament in a vote that saw major disruptions in some regions. Once again, voting did not take place in the northern Tigray region, which has seen political unrest since the devastating civil war there, and polls were closed in some areas of Amhara and Oromia, with officials citing security concerns. Abiy Ahmed was appointed prime minister in 2018 after mass protests against the long-ruling EPRDF coalition. He has managed to hold his grip on power ever since, some will say with little transparency or scrutiny from election observers or from a controlled media. Happy to welcome political analyst and journalist Zacharias Zelalem to break this down further. We should mention Zacharias is also visiting fellow with the Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Zacharias, millions of Ethiopians in conflict zones, including Tigray and parts of Amhara and Oromia, weren't able to vote. What are the implications of that, and does it affect in any measure the legitimacy of the election?
Well, this would be the second election in a row that we have entire swathes of the country excluded from the electoral process. So for the Tigray region, which is still reeling from the devastating war that killed hundreds of thousands from 2020 to 2022, this is the second straight general elections where there's absolutely no participation, meaning no representation, and 38 of the region's constituencies will remain vacant in parliament, with a lot of these war zones, especially the Oromia and Amhara regions, normally being robust zones of opposition. The exclusions of these areas due to war and other reasons from the process means a lot of the opposition to the government is also excluded from being voiced in parliament, at least for the next 5 years.
By the way, as you know, Ethiopia has been a country in open conflict or on the verge of it, whether we're talking about hostilities in Amhara and Oromia or the shifting animosities among the federal government, the Tigrayan Regional Authority, and Eritrea. Where are we now on security issues?
So there's still a lot that's up for speculation. A lot of our diplomatic sources will tell you that it is the United Arab Emirates who is the primary funder and supporter of the Ethiopian armed forces, which calls the shots in terms of whether or not the Ethiopian army will launch an offensive against neighboring Eritrea or the Tigray region again, as has been as being expected or as the Ethiopian government itself has threatened for much of the past year or two. It's one of the issues with the electoral process as a whole. The participation of political parties that could have really forced critical dialogue on these issues at the national level was not really secured. A lot of the parties had threatened to boycott, or some of them just put the very minimum amount, a very minimal symbolic, if you will, fielded a symbolic number of candidates just to avoid having their registration suspended.
The thread that I'm hearing run through your remarks is uncertainty, if anything. So what problem, if any, has this election actually solved?
Well, unfortunately, the country has been characterized by lawlessness. At least one of the primary demands of most Ethiopians, citizens, regardless of their political persuasion, is a demand for greater security in the country, and that's not something that's going to be adequately addressed by the current elections, especially when the government still continues to hold military parades and issue veiled threats of war directed to its political opponents, both in the country and in neighboring countries.
When Abiy Ahmed came to power, he was celebrated as a reformer who could bridge the country's problems. 8 years later, Ethiopia has endured a civil war, ongoing insurgencies, and deep political polarization. To what extent are these crises the result of structural issues, even happenstance, or the reflection of Ahmed's own choices, his leadership?
Yes, you're right. I mean, the term Abiy Mania was a whole thing in 2018 when he came to power and then implemented the whirlwind of reforms, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of political prisoners being released, and so many exiled politicians and journalists being invited back into the country. As I said, had there been free and fair discussions, debate, and polls in general, I think the ruling party would have been challenged on its main policy, with being its insistence on waging war against its political foes. That has been one of the core tenets of the Prosperity Party and Abiy Ahmed's leadership since coming to power. And if that aspect of his domestic policy isn't challenged, it is very hard to say that there was this sort of process that encompassed all the various viewpoints of the very, very diverse Ethiopian people. We're talking about something like 80 ethnic groups. So despite the claims that 50-something million people were registered to vote, and I believe 90% was the turnout. That's the figure issued by the National Electoral Board. Without the critical issues, so being the economy, being the insistence to wage war, without these issues being adequately dissected, it's hard to say that Ethiopia's very diverse political sphere and political viewpoints were reflected in the process that just culminated in the landslide victory of the Prosperity Party.
Again, that was journalist and analyst Zacharias Zelelam. We're going to end it there, but be sure to check out our other stories on dw.com/Africa or on social media. We'll see you next time.